Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Bruno Kreisky Forum tonight. Demise of a Dream, Social Justice, Past and Present. I'm very happy to announce this evening's talks and discussion in cooperation with the University of Vienna. I particularly thank Dr. Radka Suštova for our joint and excellent cooperation in bringing up this this expert panel. The focus topic, or the topic of the year of the Bruno Kreisky Forum is resources of democracies, and social justice is for sure one of the resources. It might be used as a resource for democracies, and as we can see, and in a very excellent book, which is also presented here, or the basis also of this expert panel, what we can also understand is that social justice, of course, had in past and present different connotations. It was based on different ideologies, or so to speak, different ideologies used the different concepts of social justice to legitimize their policies and politics. Our moderator this evening, Eva Maria Muschik, will introduce the experts on this panel. And let me please, first of all, wish you an interesting, informative evening and discussion afterwards. And I might also announce to you that a closed expert workshop is scheduled for tomorrow, starting with 10. And if you're interested in two panels in relation to the topic, then you're most welcome also to join and listen to the experts, and also, of course, contribute with questions and in the discussion. So thank you very much again, Professor Conway, Professor Erlichman, Ms. Hofmann, and Mr. Wolkenstein for joining us tonight. Thank you. Have a good evening.
Okay, very warm welcome from my side as well. I hope you can hear me all right. Okay. My name is Eva Maria Muschik. I'm a historian at the Department of Development Studies at the University of Vienna. I'm very happy to moderate tonight's book presentation and discussion of social justice in the 20th century, published by Cambridge University Press in 2024. So we'll have significant inputs from the two editors who will speak for about 40 to 50 minutes first, and then two 10-minute comments before opening up for a 30-minute Q&A session. And I understand we have to be out of here by around 8:50. So I'll keep my introduction really short and just really briefly introduce tonight's speakers and sponsors. So I'll start with Martin Conway, who's a professor of contemporary European history at the University of Oxford. He worked on the extreme right movement in Belgium in the early 20th century, on Catholic politics, and more broadly on post-war reconstruction in Belgium. And more recently, your focus has shifted to democracy in Western Europe more generally, to which also this collaborative project on social justice is closely related. And then the second speaker is Camilo Erlichman, who's a professor of history at Maastricht University. He heads the interdisciplinary research cluster on democracy in Europe, past and present, and is also the co-founder of the Occupation Studies Research Network. And you're the author and editor of many, many publications, but also you're currently working on turning your dissertation into a book project, as I understand, on cooperation and conflict in the British zone of Germany in the 1940s. And then our first commentator of today is Julia Hofmann, a sociologist with the Chamber of Labor here in Vienna. And since 2017, you've served as speaker for inequality and redistribution, as well as employment and labor relations. You're also a prolific collaborative author on topics ranging from economic growth to inflation, taxes, welfare, COVID, and much more. And last but not least, we have Fabio Wolkenstein, who's a professor of political science, also at the University of Vienna. Your work has focused on democratic theory and political parties. A first book, Rethinking Party Reform, was published by Oxford University Press in 2019. And then in 2022, Die dunkle Seite der Christdemokratie, eine Geschichte einer autoritären Versuchung, was published by C.H. Beck. And I think a book on political representation as communicative practice is coming out these days. And you're also working on another book on democratic regressions and also much more. So this, just to give you a very brief idea of the panel today. And finally, I want to thank, of course, Radka Šustrova for organizing the event and sponsoring it through her European Union-funded project on workplace agency and workplace justice in Austria and Czechoslovakia in the 20th century. The Bruno Kreisky Forum, of course, for hosting the event tonight, and the British Academy for additional support. And with that, I'll hand the word over to Martin and Camilo for some words about the edited volume, and we're very much looking forward to the discussion then. Thank you.
So we're going to speak jointly, and I'd just like to say, because Camilo's about to speak first, that it's a great pleasure to be here. Camilo will talk for about 20 minutes about the origins of this book and writing about the theme of social justice in the 20th century brings to a wider history of Europe in the 20th century. And then I will take over and we'll move more towards the present and perhaps the near future.
Yes, thank you very much. And thanks for the very kind introduction. And can I start by saying how grateful Martin and I are about this possibility of doing this presentation here, both to the Bruno Kreisky Forum, but also, of course, to Radka, who put in a lot of work into organizing this. So thanks very much for having us. I'll start this presentation with a picture that, in many respects, might be a curious way to start thinking about social justice. There we go. This is a picture of the World Economic Forum, also known as the Davos meetings. I think most people in the room will be familiar with this. And it's, of course, an unlikely place to start thinking about social justice because it's been very often associated with, in some ways, the opposite of social justice, right? For many, many decades, we thought of this as a symbol for the kind of neoliberal elites who converge there with projects to unmake social justice. But what's interesting, and what in some ways led us to start thinking about this book that you see here, is the way in which, since the mid-2010s, I would say, you see a renewed interest in questions of social justice in very unlikely fora like Davos. So as of 2017-18 forward, there has been a consistent emphasis at these meetings on questions around inequality and social justice. You probably picked up on that. But also you find them in very many other, maybe unlikely places. I've got here on this slide the Conservative Party in the UK, and when I show that picture to my students, they very often get quite upset about my talking about social justice and then starting with the Conservatives in the UK. But you find a new emphasis on in terms of a language of social justice amongst groups that we did not tend to relate or link to social justice. The same applies to the European Union, and Martin is going to talk more about that, those issues of the present in a second, which since the COVID pandemic, here you see the Next Gen EU, massive investment that was done. Since that moment has also taken on a strong emphasis on questions of investment in public infrastructures, right? So in some way we see a renewed interest, the comeback of social justice after a time where it seemed to have disappeared. But what's quite striking when you look you look into that debate, and of course a lot of that has been triggered as well by some kind of major publications. Most of you will be familiar with Thomas Piketty's book here, which triggered a renewed kind of public interest in these questions. Suddenly Obama was reading, about inequality, you might remember. What's interesting is that while those debates were going on, historians were in many ways quite absent from those discussions. They were very much shaped by social scientists, by political scientists, sociologists, but historians seem to have some kind of problem with social justice in terms of addressing it as a topic in its own right. And so that was the starting point for our book, to think about ways in which historians can work productively with the notion of social justice. And what you find when you start looking into how historians have actually addressed the topic is that there is a sense of mourning for social justice amongst a generation of historians that have written about this. Yeah? In many ways, if I can just move here, we have publications such as most famously Jeff Ely's book here, but also you might remember this book by Tony Judd, when I think he was already ill at that point, which is a sort of long swan song about the disappearance of social justice, right? So in Jeff Ely's book on democracy, we see a story of the basic gradual expansion of social rights over time. It's a story about the gradual amelioration of living standards that then in some way gets into crisis with the advent of neoliberalism. And in Tony Judd's interpretation, essentially, we have reached a moment in which we have lost the ability to create political projects that are going to deliver social justice. So there's a very, very strong sense of mourning amongst historians who've written about topics connected to social justice. But it's quite striking that although people have written quite extensively about questions around the welfare state, for example, social justice as a concept itself is not at the forefront, or has not been at the forefront of these books. And there are, I think, some rather obvious reasons for that. I've put together here just a rather impressionistic take on how other disciplines approach social justice. And as you will see, there is no shortage, really, in terms of approaches towards social justice from all sorts of disciplines. Of course, from the social sciences, but I was also intrigued by publications such as Shakespeare and social justice. So really, social justice is everywhere in a number of disciplines, but historians have been quite outside of those discussions. That was something that Martin and I thought was interesting, and that required some kind of explanation, right? And I think the explanation has something to do with this gentleman there. Of course, that's Nietzsche, and I don't deploy him very often in lectures, but Nietzsche, of course, had this very famous point about the idea that if something has a definition, then it doesn't have a history. Yeah? Now, what does that tell us? Well, essentially, historians have big difficulties in approaching a subject by starting with a fixed definition, right? Because the historical approach is very much to question the static understanding of a concept and to rather assume that, of course, notions such as social justice will have evolved over time and therefore don't take on a particular fixed meaning. Yeah? And that puts us at odds with most authors in the social sciences, who will start by defining the phenomenon of social justice and saying what it is actually about, and then try to trace how that phenomenon has played out in particular instances, how it's been implemented, and so on. But it starts normally with a very fixed definition. And historians, of course, take the kind of opposite approach, so a sort of non-normative approach that seeks to follow conceptions of social justice wherever they might lead one. Yeah? And that produces a number of issues that renders historians maybe in some ways quite unpopular with their fellow colleagues from other disciplines. And I've put together here 3 pictures from kind of my field of expertise, which is German history, which I think give a sense of how conceptions of social justice were ingrained in very different political regimes. So we have here a kind of classic Nazi propaganda poster which gravitates around a particular understanding of social justice organized around the notion of the Volksgemeinschaft. Yeah? But we have, of course, also a very strong sense of social justice in a political regime just such as the one that ruled in Western Germany after the Second World War. Here you have a poster from the Christian Democrats, right, who emphasize the question of the woman, interestingly, as the protector of the Christian family, right? So notions of social justice, even if they seem quite alien to us now, were also essential to the way in which political parties justify their existence and talk to voters in the post-war period. And if you look to Eastern Germany, of course, social justice was very much the essence of how the regime tried to legitimize its existence, right? And here you see a poster emphasizing the building projects of the regime, right? So in some ways, social justice is a question that reappears in very different regime types. And it might at first seem kind of problematic to approach the subject in such a manner and giving room to the idea that actually there might be something interesting in terms of thinking of Nazi Germany and social justice in tandem. We come back to that issue in a moment. The second problem for historians is, I think, maybe captured by these pictures here, and that's a problem of perspectives and of sources. When historians have written about issues connected to social justice, they have very often done so in connection to questions around inequality and in connection to questions around the welfare state. And much of the literature that exists on social justice is really in many ways histories of the welfare state. Now, historians who write those sort of histories, they write from the perspective of the government buildings that were set up in the post-war period. And you're all familiar with this kind of architecture that I think tells something about the sort of technocratic ethos that went into the making of these welfare regimes after the Second World War. And so one perspective that you can take is to write this as a history of the top-down implementation of social policies, yeah? Which is, I think, captured by that picture on the left. The other approach would be to say, let's try and understand how conceptions of social justice were made from below. Yeah? And on that question, there is a broad literature that looks into social movements, right? And here you see a picture from the famous Fiat strikes in Italy, which I think brings that to the fore, the question that social justice was not made in the government ministries, but was formulated in exchanges between those on the top with those protesting from below. Yeah? But it's really a question of which perspective you then take on that will shape the kind of history of social justice that you will end up producing. Now, in this book, what we try to do in some ways is to bring these perspectives together and to think about how conceptions of social justice were created in the space between rulers and ruled. When we do so, invariably, we end up dealing with a number of themes. And I think when historians approach the subject, they end up in some ways putting an emphasis on particular spheres of social justice. And this is just, I think, one way of categorizing these approaches. You might think of other ones, but it made sense to me to think of these as a distribution of categories in terms of above and below. Yeah? So this is very much the question of the distribution of power based on social class. Yeah? So that would be one approach to social justice, to think about the distribution of power amongst different social classes. The other one would be to think of this in terms of who is in and who is out. So who's part of a political community and who stands outside of that. And that marker of distinction that renders you a member of that political community can be shaped by race, by ethnicity, but also, of course, by your physical ability or disability. Yeah? So this is really a question about inclusion and exclusion within different communities. Of course, the discussion that we are most familiar with today, because it's so prominent in the public sphere, is the question about he, she, they. Yeah? So this is the question of participation, exclusion, integration based on gender and sexuality. Yeah? But I think there's a fourth dimension that very often is not talked about, and that is the difference that exists in terms of approaches towards time and age, right? So not only young and old, but also a distribution of power and resources based on one's conception of time. Yeah? What kind of vision of the past does one have? What kind of future does one envision? Yeah? So invariably, I think in each regime that we explore in the book, some of these themes come back, and they interact with one another in different ways. And each regime in some way puts together a formula about social justice that will put an emphasis on one of these aspects or a combination of them in different ways. And that's, I think, what we are tracing throughout the book. The central argument of what we do is that essentially conceptions of social justice are at the heart of fascism, of authoritarianism, of state socialism, of post-war welfare democracy, and of market fundamentalism. And this is a proposition that many people did not like when we first made it, right? So the idea that there might be something like a form of neoliberal social justice, of course, you can imagine that invites quite a strong reaction, yeah? The way we want to tell the story is to talk about it in terms of a competition between these different political formations, a competition for who has the ownership over notions of social justice, yeah? Who has the most plausible, yeah? The most plausible notion, but maybe also the notion that commands most popular support about social justice amongst the population. What that, in our view, signifies is a way in which, throughout the 20th century story that we trace, in many ways, there is a shift in the way in which governments legitimize their existence, a shift away from languages of historic privilege towards an emphasis on the kind of benefits that people can derive from government. And that's, I think, a very important part of the story we're trying to trace here, how governments start recognizing the need to legitimize their policies in terms of the kind of benefits they will bring to different populations. Now, as we trace that story, we find that there is essentially no agreement about the meaning of social justice. For some, it means civic equality. For others, it means material equality. And for yet others, it might mean also something like the maintenance of hierarchies. Yeah? And there's also no agreement amongst these different political formations in terms of the spatial limits of social justice. For some, social justice was something to be achieved on a universal, maybe even global level, whereas for others it was something rooted in the local, yeah? And something that could be achieved maybe at the level of a neighborhood or a community. Now, I want to give you a little bit more of a sense of the contents of the book by emphasizing one contribution by Ido de Haan, who talks in a sort of overarching manner about ways in which we can think of the 20th century in terms of different eras of social justice. Yeah? He makes a very plausible argument about a threefold division of the 20th century into three time periods of social justice. The first time period starts in the last quarter of the 19th century. Yeah? So roughly in the 1870s. And what we find here is that at that time, it's not only the social question, and I think most of you will be familiar with the kind of discovery of the social question as a main remit of state action. It's not only the importance attached to the social question during this moment, but it's actually more widely the sense that the market loses out its sense of being something God-given or natural. Yeah? So there's a sense that the social as a sphere of action of the state, yeah, and of society becomes a field of political activity. And we see this, of course, most notably in the way in which different political rulers sought to address issues around poverty. Think, of course, of poor relief, and the broader notion of doing something for the sort of deserving poor, those who are too young, too old, physically incapable. And of course, I think most of us, the idea of the emergence of the sort of Bismarckian welfare state will come to mind. Yeah. But what's the fundamental transformation in this moment is the sense in which the social becomes a domain of interaction between the state and the individual. For some, this is a purely economic issue. So the point is to decrease in some ways the economic dependency and insecurity of individuals. For others, it's about political rights. So adult suffrage rights. That's what's driving most notably the social democratic movement. And for others yet, it's an ethical issue. It's a religious issue even, right? So the Pope famously starts talking about social justice in his famous encyclica Rerum Novarum of 1891, yeah? So we get gradually a dynamic in which a new understanding of the market is crystallizing, yeah? The problem is not so much that the market creates poverty and dependency as such, but rather, what many people within political movements and parties start thinking, it is that the fact that the market is affecting the conditions of people to generate earnings from their own labor. Yeah? So the discussion during this period shifts towards the question of how to empower adult and able-bodied men, primarily, yeah, to maintain their capacity to work. Yeah? So this is quite a different reading from that period than your typical kind of typical exposition of the triumph, the gradual triumph of the welfare state from Bismarck to the kind of liberal reforms in the UK and then in other continental countries. We get with this into the kind of second period, which we tend to associate with the kind of breakthrough of the welfare state, roughly from the 1920s to the 1970s. Yeah? Again, the market is fundamental to the notions of social justice that come to the fore in Europe during that period. In many countries during this moment, the central driving force for the articulations of new notions of social justice is the attempt to increase national productivity. Yeah? So the question again is, how can we maintain the productive output of European nation states at a moment in which nation states are increasingly competing with one another? Yeah? This brings about new cooperative bargaining systems, yeah? A new way of dealing with trade unions and attempts to integrate them into the process of decision making, as well as an expansion of the role of the state more largely. But in general, what we see is also a new kind of collaborative role of trade unions as well as socialist and communist parties during this period. Yeah? So many of the things that we see during this age, things such as the possibility to go on a holiday, improvements in healthcare, improvements in pensions, and so on, are ways about making it possible for individuals to maintain their productivity. Yeah? So this is, again, a very different reading in some ways of social justice, one that sees social justice very much linked to the ways in which conceptions of the market are changing during this period. And finally, we end up with a period of, you might want to call this neoliberal reform. Yeah? I've labeled this here the kind of breakthrough of residualist notions of social justice between the 1970s and the 2000s. Here you see, of course, Margaret Thatcher trying to kind of propagate her policy of selling off council homes in the UK as a policy of bringing property to ordinary Britons. Yeah? So again, there is a notion here that she would never call it social justice, of course, right? But there's a notion here that policies such as turning every British person into a homeowner is going to create a form of justice. Yeah? And that kind of new conception of social justice flows, of course, then later into Tony Blair. I'll come back to him in a moment. Essentially, this is a time period in which the conception of the welfare state is that, in the way which was set up after the Second World War, is constructed as being in crisis. Yeah? And there is now, because of an emphasis on this crisis discourse, it is particularly potent, particularly strong since the 1970s, a fundamental attack on the pre-existing notions of social justice that existed in the preceding decades. Instead, what we get are two developments. One is the reformulation of social justice in terms of universal and human rights. Right? So this is a moment in which human rights start taking on a much greater importance in public discourse. Some of you might be familiar with the work of Sam Moyne, who makes a big story out of the idea that human rights in some way displaced notions of social justice during this period as the kind of, as he calls it, the last utopia, right? But certainly next to this kind of universalization of social justice into notions of human rights, we also get a kind of economization of social rights and a concomitant discourse about the way in which the state is draining society of its material assets through taxation. Yeah? The blame is now directed very strongly towards the trade unions, but also towards particular professional groups. Think of civil servants, but also think of kind of social justice professionals, right? So I'm thinking of social workers, I'm thinking of people in the healthcare sector and so on. Yeah? So there's a notion that social rights have overburdened the state, and that the state has consequently become ungovernable. The most significant impact of that kind of discourse is what I would argue is a kind of universalization of a market logic, right? So the application of a market logic to essentially all spheres of life and to all forms of social interaction. Yeah? And we see that, of course, during the so-called third way moment of Schröder and Blair, where concepts around the market infuse the whole social justice language of those political groups. Blair and Schröder, in their famous paper, the Third Way paper, talk very much about efficiency, about competition, about high performance, about fostering a new entrepreneurial spirit, about opportunity, of course. Yeah? And I quote about the springboard to personal responsibility. Yeah? Transforming a safety net of entitlements towards a springboard to personal responsibility. And the way to achieve that in their reading is through what we now call workfare systems, so essentially systems intended to kind of activate the labor force, yeah? Through investment in individuals, in their personal development, training, and so on, to prevent them from becoming unemployed, right? But it's, of course, a major redefinition of the way in which social justice is framed in the public debate. Yeah? Another way to look at that would be to focus on Nancy Fraser, who you see here, who coined the idea of this moment, the 1970s to 2000s, not simply as a moment that sees the advent and eventual triumph of market fundamentalist ideas, but which can also be read as a transition from redistribution, yeah? This is a kind of old welfare state that redistributes material assets towards a new social justice formation, for social justice regime organized around the notion of recognition, of the recognition of differences and of different identities. Yeah? All right, let me see. I've been talking for quite a while. Yeah. So I'm going to think jump through a few slides for the sake of time and conclude with a couple of larger thoughts that I think crystallize throughout the book. In the 20th century, what we see throughout these three areas that I've just traced, and we have a number of chapters that explore more specific issues, questions around migration, the conceptions of social justice in particular regimes, think of fascism, think of the transition between authoritarian regimes in the Czech-speaking lands. What we see throughout these different case studies is the fact that in many ways, we still have the primacy of the nation state during the 20th century and of local conceptions of social justice, and that this gradually is displaced towards the end of the 20th century, but that the nation state and the local area are fundamental in for the most part of the 20th century. Social justice during this period was very often defined by experts, was defined by elites. It was rooted in top-down policies of social amelioration, where those in power thought that they knew better than society writ large in terms of how to deliver social justice. And that went hand in hand with a kind of explosion in the ambitions of state and public institutions. So, irrespective of which kind of political party was in power during the 20th century, there is an increase in the ambition of states to turn themselves into agents of delivering their form of social justice. Social justice was not only a mechanism for regimes to legitimize themselves towards their own populace, but it was also a mechanism to legitimize imperial rule. Yeah? And this is, I think, one of the dimensions that we don't cover enough, actually, in the book, but which deserves, I think, to be taken seriously. The imperial frame and the imperial kind of laboratory as a place in which conceptions of social justice are tried out, are tested, right, and which find their way back into the metropolis, but also empire being justified in terms of the social progress, of course, that European colonial states assumed or pretended that they were delivering to colonial populations. And finally, I think one important point of the book is to emphasize how, in many ways, the decades after 1945 have also taken on a rather mythical element in public discourse. We are all familiar with the notion of, Trump talking about, making America great again and going back to some kind of golden era. Of course, he's not talking about social justice, but we find very often in public debate the notion that we can go back to a moment in European history, which normally is dated somewhere around the 1950s or 1960s, where you had real progress in terms of material equality. Yeah? What the book also shows, however, is that in many ways, that promise of equality ended up being quite mythical in many places of Europe. Social inequality was an enduring reality. Poverty and marginalization continued. And inequality, in fact, was not massively reduced during this period. And I think that's kind of sad note to end the presentation on. But it's important to bring that sense back into the writing of 20th century European history, which is very often narrated in the manner of the picture here on the top right, as a kind of expansion of the entitlements and living standards of the middle classes who are, relishing and enjoying their new TV setup. Yeah? But the reality is also that we have banlieues and ghettos and places of marginalization, such as the one you see here in post-war France, but also the rather extreme marginalization of particular groups of the population, such as migrant workers. And you see here Turkish migrant workers in Germany, who of course lived in rather atrocious living conditions in the 1960s and 70s. So I think it's important to reconcile those two kind of elements. So yes, material progress, right, and advancement for some groups, but also what you might want to call the kind of dark side of social justice in the post-war period. And on that note, I'll hand over to Martin, who might want to take the story further into the history of the present and the ways in which social justice might have lost its centrality, or maybe not, during those decades.
Well, thank you very much, Camilo. Yes, I want to try to write the next chapter, which is perhaps rather easy in the sense that nobody knows quite what the next chapter will be, but is also quite difficult because I think, like many people in this room, I don't really feel that I know quite what's going to happen in European politics next over the coming 5 to 10 years, beyond the fact that I think that there'll be quite a lot of it. There'll be quite a lot of difference and quite a lot of change, and I think speaking at this time in this city in particular, one's conscious of the degree to which the shape of politics has been shifting very quickly. And it would be very rash to say that you can present a teleology of where we're going to end up in the coming years. But I think what we can already say is that a particular way of thinking about social justice that was inherited from the 20th century is over. And the most fatuous thing to say is, of course, that we don't live in the 20th century anymore, and that any of the notions about social justice that we might have inherited from the 20th century and that Camilo has presented this evening are probably not a very good guide to the sort of social justice debates and disputes and conflicts that we're likely to see in the coming years. A few suggestions about the evolving place of social justice in contemporary political and social debate. First of all, it's no longer primarily about the state. And Camilo has already said that very well, that the former centrality of the state and of its apparatus of institutions, of experts, for the construction of social justice, whether it was a successful project or not, that era of a state-led form of social justice is surely over, because there has been a general retreat of the state in its national, regional, and local manifestations from the management of the issues that we associate with social justice. Yes, the state still has quite a leading role in the allocation of housing, in the organization of education and health, but beyond that, there's a sense that actually the state has retreated quite markedly from the ambition to bring about regimes of social justice in Europe, West, East, North, and South. Perhaps if you want to look for the legacy of a kind of certain state-led model of social justice, you will most obviously look to Western Scandinavia, to those states there where the pace of change in the 21st century has been much less rapid than elsewhere. But elsewhere, the leading role of the state is surely not part of how social justice is going to evolve in the coming years. Instead, the sort of engagement with issues of social justice has migrated to other organizations. European Union, the way in which the European Union has, for all the difficulties of its own internal governance over the last 10 years, has surely become an institution which actually has quite a lot to do with the management of social justice, not because it's somehow in a rapacious way taking power from nation states and vesting it in concrete institutions in Brussels, but because it's actually doing an awful lot in terms of the establishment of new norms, the dissemination of new practices, and as Camilo talked about earlier, about the allocation of new sums of money after the COVID scandals, or COVID crisis, to the development of projects of social justice in less favoured areas of the European Union. In that sense, the European Union is becoming one of the principal institutions in the construction of social justice, and one of the ways in which national governments and local governments can be held to account for policies that seem to offend against principles of social justice. The other place where you can look to social justice coming to the fore is surely the law, the courts, justice. There's a very marked way in which the discussion of social justice has moved in the last 10, 15 years from the domain of parliaments and political parties and the civil society, shall we say, to the more specific domains of cases in courts and people seeking redress against their grievances through legal procedures and through the willingness of the courts to become engaged in issues of social justice. Think of the degree to which the courts have become involved in issues of sexuality, fertility, reproduction, and so on over the last few years, in issues of racial inequality. Courts have had a lot to say, for better or for worse, in the way in which society engages with those issues. So the European Union, the courts, these are places in which social justice has been discussed in recent years, and where I would have the expectation that they will become increasingly influential players. But they will also be operating in the context of a whole range of pressure groups and campaigning organizations. If there's one thing that's very characteristic of European politics in the 21st century, it's surely the very fast-moving world of pressure groups and campaigns. And the word campaign has become, I think, the way in which one would primarily describe the conduct of political debate in Europe in the 2020s. It's become campaigns, again, for better or for worse, about all sorts of issues that tend to surge to the fore of political discussion and then perhaps almost as quickly disappear. And so you can have the great surge of campaigns about racism, about women's rights in France in recent months. These are issues of social justice, but they're probably likely to be impermanent in their presence in the political sphere. But campaigning organizations, which are often engaged in a kind of conflict with each other for primacy in these sort of debates, are surely now one of the principal vehicles by which social justice is discussed in 21st century Europe. They're engaged in talking about the way in which societies have to come to terms with the changing shape of families, changing issues of sexuality, changing issues of nationality, of citizenship between people who've lived here forever, so to speak, and people who've arrived in the last 50 years or in the last 10 years. And those sorts of issues about citizenship are clearly going to be very central to the way in which social justice is developed over the future. And populist movements, the new political movements that have emerged on the left and the right, occupy an ambivalent role in this respect. They are both political parties in terms of their campaigning for seats in local and national elections, as in Vienna this week, but they are also organizations that seek to stand outside that political process and to campaign in the name of some rather mythical, invoked real people who are not part of what political organizations are said to be about. And it's very interesting to see the extent to which these new political parties, predominantly one would say on the political right, if you want to put that label on them, have actually become some of the principal spokespeople for new languages of social justice over recent years. They talk about it obviously in terms of the blocking power of the old state apparatus and how they see that as having been an obstacle to the achievement of true social justice. But they also then put forward their own definitions, perhaps rather incoherently, of what social justice ought to be. It ought to be focused on the people, the real people, the insiders, and should somehow therefore exclude people who they describe as they or the others, or people who are somehow the undeserving recipients of policies of social justice. They want to focus it on to families, but in doing so, they were aware that if they try to go back to a mid-20th century model of the family, they're not going to really get much support from a society that has clearly moved beyond that. So populist parties have moved much further towards a female-first rhetoric of mothers bringing up children often in quite difficult single-parent family situations. That's become part of what populist parties are about. And they're also about supporting provincials against so-called metropolitan centres of power that they think of as being the opponents of real social justice. So much of the rhetoric in France, mobilised by the Rassemblement National, is about a provincial rhetoric of the way in which the true France has been left behind by a metropolitan elite who don't understand the real problems. And so when Marine Le Pen wins the next French presidential election, as seems to be likely unless she falls over between now and the election, then she will be actually coming into office campaigning on a really rather strange retro sort of invocation of the power of the French nation state, and a very modern and interesting combination of forms of prejudice that are associated with a long-standing tradition of the extreme right in French politics, and a much more vivid tradition, probably, of the pressures from below, of the outsiders, of the forgotten, of the marginalized in French society. So it's in these strange places that we're going to find rhetorics of social justice in the 21st century, not coming out of the traditional political vehicles. Christian Democrats, social democrats, in this country as in many others in Europe, still have plenty to say about social justice, and I would hasten to say also plenty to do about social justice. They have plenty of interesting ideas to bring to that debate. But I find difficulty in thinking that those parties are going to be the principal vehicles for talking about social justice in the coming years. Instead, I think social justice will have moved much more to that amorphous world of campaigning organizations, where it is a whole cacophony of rights and demands that will come to the fore. Associations that are concerned above all with issues of identity. And I think any of us who teach the politics of contemporary Europe are very used to talking about the shift in the shape of politics from politics of class and of social organizations to a politics of identities. But that must actually be true when talking about social justice. In place of discussions around social justice related to class, we're going to hear discussions based around race, we're going to hear discussions based around disability, and ones about sexuality. And that's going to create a whole diverse range of campaigns. Call it perhaps, to go back to the issue of neoliberalism, a market for social justice in which a whole variety of campaigns are going to be competing in many ways in a rather zero-sum way for the actual ownership of slogans and policies and actions on social justice that at the present are really up for grabs, as you might say in English colloquial phrase. They're available to be won by a variety of political forces. The era when any political force is likely to win a majority, more than 50%, in a European election conducted in a fair way, is quite unlikely to happen anytime soon. We're in a multi-party, multipolar structure, and the issue of social justice is likely to be fought over between a variety of different campaigning organizations where, as is the case, say, in Belgium or the Netherlands, any party that gets over 15% of the vote is achieving a huge feat of achievement in a situation where actually there's probably likely to be 12 parties competing for votes. So this is a contest for social justice, which is going to have a whole series of campaigning organizations around it and a whole series of political forces that are trying to win votes in a rather transient way. And because it will be based around identities, around how far states and social and political organizations are respecting the rights of people, then it's going to be very much one that's conducted from the personhood outwards, from the individual outwards. Those of us who have the privilege to teach the young know that when we're talking about the issues of the present day, they often start from issues of identity that they associate with perhaps where they come from, what their family background is, but more especially about how they have actually fashioned themselves as particular identities around their tastes, their interests, their habits, their values. And that sort of territory is where social justice now exists. It exists in the personal, and it's going to be the projection from the personal to the social and to the political, which is going to be the interesting element of the coming years, in which it will be increasingly difficult, I think, for political parties to somehow tell people what social justice is. People will feel social justice, and they will then try to enact it in their own lives and in the lives of the communities through a whole series of forms of engagement. Let us never hear that there's been a decline of the political, shall we say, among younger people in Europe. It's that their definition of the political is very different from what older generations might have regarded as the political. So their rights that they will be seeking are ones of recognition, of protection, and also a whole set of baggage of unsolved problems from the 20th century. Problems of colonialism, problems of forced migration, problems of state-led policies that actually led to the oppression of various groups within European society. One thinks of Roma, one thinks of migrant populations, one thinks of the way to which so much social welfare in the later 20th century involved rather forced policies of separating children from their parents and so on. That is a huge baggage of historic rights that in this new world where the courts will have a considerable role, those issues are going to be brought to the fore continuously in European politics over the coming years with a whole series of unsolved problems. Think of the issues of Algerian Maghrebian rights in France and the legal disputes that will generate over the coming years. I say that not to depress us, but to recognize that it's in those sort of new spheres that issues of social justice will find their place in a discourse which is very different from one that might be run by political parties, by elections, and by national governments. And beyond that, there are probably other territories of social justice that are only just becoming visible. Obviously, the emergence of Greens and of environmental politics in Europe over the last 20 years has been really very exciting and very interesting. But it raises the issue of how far social justice can actually be separated from the issue of the environment. In many ways, one might be thinking that in the coming years, the issue of the rights of the environment will become more important than the rights of a sort of Anthropocene-centered human population. It will be the way in which social justice is no longer seen as just a matter between and among peoples, but also something about the relationship between populations and that broader national environment, not to mention the degree to which, in a rather diminished and declining, possibly, Europe of the 21st century, it will be increasingly the global south that will set the terms of debate in social justice. Now, I say all of that with the intention of finishing in 2 minutes by saying that actually this is about a broader history of the present and the extent to which something which I think historians have been slow to embrace, which is the degree to which the 20th century is over, and that we have to actually think in new historical terms. Camilo and I are now getting pretty old, and we were all forged in a way of thinking about history that was a very particular moment in the latter decades of the 20th century when the predominant issue was in many ways 1945. It was about that long return of Europe from a sort of year zero in the middle of the 20th century, which was as true in Eastern Europe up and from 1945 to the 1990s as it was in Western Europe. That era is now emphatically over, and this very unfamiliar territory of social justice that I've been trying to sketch in incredibly approximate terms, because I don't know it any better than you, is part of that messy history of the early 21st century that we know is different, but that we don't yet have the words really to describe. But I'd like to tell you that I think social justice will be one of the terms that we use to describe it. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this wonderful introduction. I'll hand the word right over to Julia for the first comments.
Time on, because I have 10 minutes. It's a really fascinating and highly relevant book you two wrote. I don't know who to talk, left and right. I read the book last week, and against the background of the recent developments in Austria, we have a new government in Austria since a few weeks. I found one special text really interesting. This was the one on taxation in Belgium in the 1920s, because it was. Don't often say that. It was more or less a rather special article, but when reading this, I was reminded in recent debates on wealth taxation and income taxation, because the author argues that liberals and Catholic fractions in Belgium in the 1970s were against income taxes, and the arguments were exactly the same that we also hear today. It's capital is a timid idea, taxes hinder economic competitiveness. And back then, Belgium had a social democratic finance minister, and if I read that correctly, no social democrat had ever held the position in Belgium ever. And in Austria, we had a similar situation the last decades because we had almost exclusively conservative finance ministers in the recent decades. And now for the first time in history, since a long history I would say, we have a social democrat finance minister back in office. And he was immediately faced with the same accusations as his Belgian counterpart in the 1920s. He was not even in office, and then he had to swear in public media that there will that he doesn't want to introduce wealth taxes, that he doesn't want to raise income taxes for the very rich and all that. It's really interesting how arguments don't change over like 100 years. Unfortunately, his room for maneuver is extremely limited due to the European Union and its fiscal rules, because in Austria at the moment we face a really difficult budgetary situation at the moment. So a truly social democratic tax and budget policy remains, I think, a little more than a dream now, but yeah, the article reminded me of the situation we have in Austria at the moment. I just wanted to point 2 or 3 aspects I found really interesting from the Austrian perspective on your book. And not because I'm a sociologist, because I don't think that I define social justice now in terms of material social inequality and the status of material social inequality. I don't do that as a sociologist. I would say I do it because I have to do it in 10 minutes and to keep my eyes focused and I feeling more safe in empirical analysis of the status of social inequality. And you wrote in your introduction that Europe got closest to achieve material equality in this Trente Glorieuses and this period after World War II, and that inequality since then has worsened. And you also put forward the argument that Thomas Piketty put forward, and I found it really good that you say that there is always a sense of nostalgia in this. You also put that in your presentation now, because we have that also in Austria. It was the time when Bruno Kreisky was in office where we had a lot of welfare state measures taking in place, which brought wealth to the middle classes or to the establishing middle classes in Austria. But of course, the social reality was more complex. We had also migrant workers in Austria, Turkish migrant workers. We had women which were not on the workplace in that time, and which were facing really difficulties in terms of their living standards. So I don't want to glorify the past, but given your argument that in terms of social inequality, the last decades worsened the situation, I asked myself about the actual state of social justice in Austria nowadays. And I would agree you that neoliberal policies, globalization, multiple crises have exacerbated inequality in Austria as well. When we look back in the 1980s, we discussed about the 2/3 society. So it's a broad middle class society with 2/3 which are stable, which have a good life. And today we discuss more about oligarchic structures, refeudalization of society. I think it's quite interesting what historians say about this term, refeudalization, but that's what social sciences say about it. And I would argue that also distributional conflicts in Austria have become more visible and actually a little bit more intense than 30 or 40 years ago. I think that's also what you mean with social justice from below. We have a lot of movements which like to try to push the topic. Social inequality in Austria gets worse, but I would also argue there is room for maneuver. And it's quite good that you say it's not the state anymore, because I would disagree. Okay. And I would say the welfare state can still play an important role for social justice, for the status of social justice, at least in Austria in the next decades. That's my counterpoint. But just look at the figures. We see that the labor share of income was around 67% in the 1970s, and now it's 60%. So the balance between labor and capital income has shifted also in Austria. The pay ratios between the ones at the very top, the managers, and the median wages of employees has risen dramatically. We don't have so long figures, but in the early 2000s we had a gap between 1 to 20, and now we have 1 to 80. So manager wages are really growing, increasing really hard. And we see increasing labor market fragmentation also in Austria. We see rising unemployment since the 1980s, so the end of the full employment era, so to say. We see that there is a growing industrial reserve army, when we can say it like that, which also puts pressure on the ones which are already in the labor market, because they tend to accept worse working conditions. We see more or less a persistent underclass within the workforce, and this one is also left behind within the last 10, 15 years, I would say, when we compare their median gross annual income with the gross annual income of persons in stable full-time positions. So there's a lot of problems on the labor market in terms of inequalities. And there's also a lot of problems outside the labor markets, because when we look at female labor participation, of course, this has risen sharply, and that's good news, but we see this persistent gender inequalities also in Austria. Austria has the second highest gender pay gap in the European Union. And women still bear the majority also of unpaid care and domestic labor. I think that these topics on growing inequalities on the labor market in terms of paid work and unpaid work are like one of the major topics of social justice also for Austria in the future decades. Another big issue we have in Austria is wealth inequality. Wealth inequality is, we don't have so good figures, but it's rising in the last years, and Austria ranks among the highest, among the countries with the highest wealth inequality also in Europe. The top 1% owns about 50%, 40 to 50% of Austria's net wealth. And we know that extreme wealth undermines meritocracy, it undermines economic fairness, but it's also a threat to democracy. We see that. In former times, I also had to explain that. Now I just say must. We see the problems which come with a lot of richness. And why I would argue, and that's the last point I make, because then my timer says I'm off. I think that the welfare state is important in Austria because we see that it has been in the future the crucial mechanism of reducing market-driven inequalities and social inequalities, and it still is. We have redistribution studies in Austria which show how stable the effect of redistribution still is in Austria. We had these discussions a lot in the last decades in social policy analysis. Is there a race to the bottom? Are European welfare states all going the neoliberal way? And actually, figures say no. Welfare states remain in their models. Austria is a conservative welfare model with a lot of problems which come with the conservative model, the prioritization of contribution basements, or the establishing this social order with women doing the domestic labor and all that stuff. But still, there's a lot of redistribution going ahead with the welfare state. The bottom 10% would have a national income of around 1%, and now it's 5%. So we see welfare state distribution works, not perfectly, but still it works. So I would argue we should not give over the role of the welfare state, but trying to defend it. And I think and now I come back to my former boss, who is now finance minister. I think the big question and a big discussion we will have in the Austrian welfare state future is its future financing. We have huge topics going on with aging population, long-term care, how can we finance the welfare state in the future. But given that welfare state is like one of the proxies, top-down proxies for for establishing top-down social justice, I would think that the debate on who is financing the welfare state is one really important for social justice debates in Austria in the future. And I would say that there is room for maneuver because corporate taxes account only for 8% of total revenue. We have tax revenue in Austria, and wealth taxes are only 1.4% at the moment. So there is still room for more social justice in terms of taxation and in terms of the future of the welfare state, and as an important angle for social justice.
I don't think that was related, but yeah, thank you very much, Julia. Fabio, please.
Okay, well, you had to listen to a lot of people speaking, and obviously this was very rich and informative, but maybe you're all hungry and you don't want to listen to more. But I feel I need to strike a balance between doing the job I was invited to do and keeping you entertained. So I'll try to be short and entertaining. Hopefully I managed to be one of the two things at least. So shout out to Radka for inviting me. As a hobby historian, this is like, I guess, how a Formula One fan might feel sitting in a car. Anyways. So I really want to make one point, draw attention to this. Maybe this is something that can generate some debate afterwards. This book is obviously an incredible achievement. It's, as I said, and as you could glean from the talks, incredibly rich in perspectives. And to me, one of the most useful and powerful aspects of the book is that it reminds us that no single political movement or party owns or has historically owned the concept or the language of social justice. And the fact that, some of you might know this, a counter-revolutionary Italian Jesuit, Luigi Tapparelli, coined the term social justice around 1840, should nicely underline this point. And I think the same is true for what Martin has been saying about the current shift towards identities, in the sense that identity politics is obviously something you find on the left and on the right, and those on the right who decry identity politics are happily invoking then the pure rural identities or masculine identities or what have you. We don't even need to look to the US to understand the relevance of that point. But anyways, in the brief comment that I want to make, I want to actually talk about one particular thing that struck me as kind of the primary lesson that I learned from the book. And that primary lesson concerns what I would call the goal, or perhaps more specifically, now using this sort of nicely highbrow language, the telos of social justice. And I think the book makes clear that in the 20th century, social justice has been used mostly as what I would consider a teleological concept. That is to say, those who invoke the concept, or perhaps more accurately, their preferred conception of social justice, had some ideal outcome or end state in mind. You know, whether that was something that could actually be achieved or whether that remained purely aspirational is a completely different issue. But it was clear that political action was aimed at creating some sort of ideal social order or a particular pattern of distribution of goods or statuses. And some of the most ambitious projects of that sort really aimed to transform human nature in its entirety and create a new man. I don't need to remind anyone in the Kreisky Forum about the social democratic versions of this, but what the book shows is that you find similar sort of broader pictures of an ideal state of society, a telos, in early Catholic movements and parties, where a just society was one in which there was harmony between the classes. Do bear in mind, this was explicitly mobilized against ideas of class struggle. The patriarchal nuclear family was the core unit of society, And ultimately, this harmonious, integrated whole was the telos of social justice, properly understood. Similarly, perhaps we might now, feel like getting a bit of a stomach ache when I mention that fascist versions of social justice, which figure prominently in this book, and there's a whole chapter devoted to it, they promoted an ideal of society that was derivative of this organic, perhaps, hierarchical vision that you also find in some of Catholic thinking, especially since the encyclical Rerum Novarum that Camilo mentioned. And that sort of vision was sometimes paired with perhaps a less than Christian idea about improving the quality of the people with eugenic interventions and efforts to enhance racial purity. Do bear in mind that came very late also in Italian fascism after 1935 only. So at any rate, what you have is really blueprints of society, a telos that social justice identifies, right? And what the book shows, and I think this is really, really helpful to think about our present moment, is that there were two major developments, historical developments, that made such grand political projects seem both plausible and indeed feasible. And the first of this development is generally the rise of state power and state capacity in the second half of the 20th century. That is the expansion of state intervention, the remit of the state in society, supported by an increasingly rationalized Weberian bureaucracy. We know that Max Weber, for good reason, wrote about these sorts of developments. So the state increasingly emerged as an instrument that could be used to shape society, and even groups that previously were skeptical about state capacity, indeed the Catholics again, started to embrace the modern state. And that was again the doing of Pope Leo XIII and his big change in Catholic doctrine. So this was the first development, the rise of state power. And the second development, I think, which is really crucial, was what the second chapter of the book beautifully describes as the denaturalization of the market around the end of the 19th century. And what was meant by that? The denaturalization of the market is a really important shift in collective thinking, because it meant that one moved away from the previously very widespread notion, at least in sort of economic thought and maybe early sociology, that market relations would almost invariably produce some harmony of interests. That's something that even Keynes engaged with, critically, of course, right? And it was not only Marxists who challenged that point, obviously they did, because they invoked class antagonism. But it was also, again, Catholics who did, because Rerum Novarum, again, this crucial encyclical, is essentially an encyclical that says, look, harmony is disturbed by the rise of capitalism. So markets, as a result, came to be seen as man-made, as artifacts that we can adjust, intervene in, and shape. So the rise of state power and the denaturalization of the market, which is really not a natural way or not a evident or obvious way of thinking about it, were two historical shifts that made thinking about social justice as having a telos possible. And what I thought was really interesting is that in the book there is only one broader vision of social justice that is decidedly non-teleological, right? And that is associated with forms of what we might call free market liberalism or neoliberalism or a revival of classical liberalism, if we stick to the language preferred by those who advocated it. And that became increasingly popular on the right in the 80s, on the left in the 90s. And I think that's strikingly interesting. There is something going on there where there was no telos anymore. And I think in this sense it is, philosophically speaking, a different conception of social justice. I mean, I think, Martin, you mentioned that, or maybe it was Camilo, that people who advocated these ideas would even deny that there was something as social justice and not reach for the term. You mentioned Thatcher, which he would never say that. At any rate, one of the most important exponents of this brand of liberalism, a bit of a local hero here, which was Friedrich von Hayek, not a local hero in the Kreisky Forum, of course, but maybe in Austria. He suggested that this particular telos or end state of social justice could only really be achieved at the expense of freedom. And what's ingenious about Hayek's path to that, I'm a very close reader of Hayek, and I don't want to make this a point about Hayek, but I think it's still worthwhile thinking about it, is that Hayek arrived at this conclusion by attacking the two premises or questioning the value of the two historical developments that made it possible to think of social justice in teleological terms in the first place, the rise of state power and the denaturalization of the market. Hayek's great intellectual move is indeed the renaturalization of markets as organically evolved orders, too complex for us to understand due to the myriad individual actions and transactions that take place across time and space. So the market for him has no will. We cannot understand it. There's no agency behind it. And as such, it makes no sense, he says, to speak of it as unjust in the first place. It's almost like a force of nature. He writes in Law, Legislation, and Liberty that the results of the spontaneous ordering of the market must not be interpreted as if some thinking being deliberately decided them, or as if the particular benefits or harm different persons derived from them were determined by deliberate acts of will and could therefore be guided by moral rules. Nor importantly can the market be steered. Being too complex to govern, any intervention of a powerful state, so this is the attack on state power, into the market is bound to be both futile and dangerous. Futile because, you can't actually do this. You can't create a patent result of distribution or anything else. And dangerous because any of these interventions will ultimately lead to unjust coercion. Now, the only viable conception of social justice available on this view is one that maximizes equality of opportunity, as the book is, very, very nicely underlines. And obviously, I'm not saying there's anything good or bad about it. I just want to draw attention to this. But that is a process conception of social justice and not an outcome, not a teleological conception. We only equip people with the ability of participating in a process whose outcomes are not to be specified through agency. That is an enormously important shift. And that means we go back behind these two key movements of the denaturalizations of the market on the one hand and the rise of state power on the other. And so why am I talking about this? Well, of course, I'm just intrinsically interested in it, but there's also another point, and I'm going to close with that because I'm running out of time, goodness me. And I think what certainly strikes me as true is that any of these old-fashioned teleological views of social justice have fallen out of fashion. And I don't think that this is because we all embraced Hayekian thought. I think most avowed Hayekians I met in my life have never read Hayek, right? Let's be honest about that. But I think there is just no broader social vision readily available in the political mainstream that even closely corresponds to the kinds of visions that we find in the early 20th century, as the book details. And I think that also indicates that the idea of political progress, once a staple of liberal and left-wing thinking, has been largely dismissed in favor of perhaps some sort of technological idea of progress. And in the end, I wonder, that's the question the book left me, who actually still believes in state capacity, even after the COVID-19 pandemic, where we've seen that state capacity is very real, in contrast to what a lot of people in social sciences believe, and who actually believes that markets are fundamentally malleable. People look at Trump buying a Tesla from Elon Musk and think, look, this is the free market. To me, this is corporatism, but we can debate that later. All I want to say is, I think there is something to be learned about this historical juncture where state capacity on the one hand, and on the other hand, a denaturalization of markets made it possible to think of the state as a vehicle through which social justice as a broad transformative project can be implemented. We might have been way beyond that point, just as I'm way beyond my time, and so I close here. Thank you.